the old world is ending, and we have the opportunity to rethink everything. This is a show about the structural problems in our world and the real solutions that we have today to transition from an apocalyptic storm of war, scarcity, and ecological collapse into a collaborative and sustainable futuristic society that serves all life. You may think it's an impossible dream, but the alternative is an inevitable nightmare. We're your hosts, Zachary Marlowe, Matt Holton, and Amanda Smith. And together, when we can move past this economic absurdity to come together and actualize our collective potential to create something completely new, we are Moneyless Society. It seems like the cursed phrase, human nature, is the final argument against any societal improvement. It's the fool's magic bullet to shoot down anything that benefits everyone. And it's manipulated to say we can't give people a better life or loosen the bounds of our controlling, distrustful, and unequal society because human nature has some base and unshakable violence within it, a careening drive toward destruction, chaos, and selfishness. The tragedy of the commons, where anytime things are nice and everyone has equal access, someone will get lazy or take more than they need and leech off society, spoiling it for the rest of us. Because it's human nature to take more than you need, to compete and connive, and to engage in shameless violence and exploitation. Which is funny because that's exactly the outcome of our current system of capitalism and its central guiding principle, that it is in our nature to act in self-interest, and to encourage this at every turn to make it our central value, through the invisible hand of the market, magically lift all boats. One of the guiding lights that keeps us pushing onward to a better world through the chaos and flagrant violence and inhumanity that has overwhelmed the world today is that our fundamental understanding of who and what we are is wrong. It is not in our nature to exploit and destroy our own home and to wage war on our own species. If that was our inborn drive, we wouldn't have made it this far. We are social beings. That is our primary adaptation to the challenge of nature. And it is not the law of the jungle to pillage and plunder and destroy just for the sake of it, to ruin your own habitat. To quote a meme, if one monkey hoarded all the other bananas while the rest starved, we would study it to find out what went wrong. But when a human does it, we put them on the cover of Forbes. Our base conclusion, which the social sciences have roundly proved, is that we are environmental beings, born half-formed to adapt to our changing environment. As we come to the last episode of our first season of Moneyless Society, this is today's topic, human nature. Today's guest is a great personal friend and a great RBE activist, Professor Jeff Cates, who just completed his master's in sociology. So, time's running out, oceans are on fire. Jeff, let's get to the bottom of this. What is human nature?
Well, the topic of human nature obviously is quite huge, right? That is quite an interesting place to start, I would say. I don't know if you are all familiar with the work of Robert Sapolsky. He's an anthropologist and a neuroscientist from Stanford University. And he gave a description of human nature that I think is the most poignant I've ever heard. And he said that the nature of our nature is not to be particularly constrained by our nature. We have more social variability than any species we've ever come to find. And so if there is anything that we could call human nature, it's our ability to adapt and change to given environments. And then as a sociologist, I really like that definition because a lot of what sociologists is talking about is the way in which our behaviors are socialized from the culture we're brought up in. And so for me, that would be the best way to begin to look at human nature, but it's specifically how it relates to the market and money systems. There'd be two books that I would recommend everybody probably read to get up to speed on that. The first book I would recommend is a book called The Great Transformation by a guy named Karl Polanyi. He was an anthropologist. And what he details in that book is the great transformation from societies that did not use a market, which in our terms of using the term market, what he was talking about was the production of commodities to be bought and sold for profit. Human civilizations just didn't work like that for most of human existence. And the way in which that particular culture which it really is. The market is a certain kind of culture, right? That was really forced upon people in many ways. And so this particular market culture that he was talking about, Karl Polanyi, in his book, was that most people that lived in rural areas or indigenous groups, they had a much different way of treating each other and producing things and distributing things to each other in a way in which Marshall Sahlins, anthropologist, also calls a gift economy, where there was no quid pro quo between people, right? You know, if we live in a community together and you do something for me, I will do something for you later, but it isn't right there in that particular moment. Matter of fact, if I gave you something in our community and you tried to give me something back immediately, they would see that as rude. That wouldn't actually be something they would think you're trying to cut ties with each other. And so that entire mentality of trade that we talk about today in the market actually was something that people generally only did prior to about the 15th century, really only did with people that they didn't know, or they were enemies with, or they were getting ready to go to war with. So this whole introduction of this market logic was actually built on a basis of tension and violence. And it's an interesting history, but I think what Karl was trying to say is that how people used to live, really this market culture was spread largely by England in around the 16th century, I believe is what he was describing in that book. I have the book over here, I can get it out, but what he was talking about was that in an early industrial revolution society, there were industries that were actually running out of labor, because in these early industries, when the industrial revolution was first happening, these industries were brutal. Even Karl calls them satanic mills. Where people were just worked to the bone and like worked long hours to death and almost death, losing hands and fingers for running these big machinery. So they had a labor problem. They couldn't keep people working. So they had these things they called enclosures, where they just said, these new areas and these rural areas of England, you all now owe us a tax that you weren't paying prior to this enclosure. And this tax can only be paid through money that you would get by submitting your labor to these industries in town. And so it forced these rural people who were surviving just fine without wage labor to have to go work in these factories to get enough money to pay the tax to the king. And so that's one way the market actually spread throughout the world. And so it's a fascinating history to learn about, but it's also one of those things where you kind of realize once you read stuff like that this whole idea of the market wasn't like, we were like, oh, feudalism's a really shitty idea. Here, I got a better idea. That's just not how capitalism spread across the world. It spread through force and violence. It wasn't like some rational decision people were making on what was better than feudalism.
I feel like we're your students already. And on that note, I believe we're speaking with a professor, right? You teach in this vein. Is that correct?
Yeah, I teach sociology at Boise State University, and I just got hired at the College of Western Idaho yesterday.
So congratulations on both of those things. One of the things that you were saying, you mentioned Marshall Sahlins' Original Influence Society study, basically. Yeah. That's something I'm a big promoter of. And you made the note that in the reciprocal relationship people had within those types of tribes and communities, it would be seen as rude or a severance of relationship to automatically reciprocate a service or a good. Is that right? Could you expound on that a little bit and how that contrasts what we do today, how the kind of reciprocal relationship we have today is very impersonal versus one that's based on, I would dare say, collectivism, in which people know that in a community, if like I give you a basket of tomatoes, one day down the road, you're going to fix my roof if it leaks kind of thing, you know, like it's just a given. You know, the first thing I always like to talk about, to expand on that, is it's really hard for us to conceptualize how different the world used to be prior to the spread of what we call capitalism today. It's such an embedded part of how we think about human relationships that it's almost difficult to think that people really didn't quantify what was owed to each other, right? Like people weren't writing down ledgers. Like, you gave me tomatoes 2 years ago. Now this calculates the 3 shingles on my roof 2 years from now. Like, people just didn't think of each other that way. And it becomes difficult to even describe how the world used to be because of how we are so enmeshed in a world where everything is commodified, right? Even your very being is commodified, even beyond your control, with all this surveillance capitalism stuff that goes on. We are the product.
Yeah. If you don't know what the product is, the product is you, right?
I was just going to say that I've been listening to a lot of David Graeber's talks, and hearing him talk about the ways that the history of money is so intertwined with violence, that some of the first instances of quantifying social relations is in, like, if you kill someone, or if you commit some crime, or you do something, deadly. So it's just like, it just really makes it abundant to me, the violent nature of this relation and how antisocial it is, because it's like, if you, he talked about this anthropologist who came to this village, and everyone in the village came and brought her all these gifts. And she was just like, what do I do? What do I do? And they said, okay, you can't give somebody, these are gifts. You have to give something back, though. You have to keep this sort of, this tension of this social tension there, this connection, this kind of web of debt, but not debt as we know it, as in, the debt of a slave. But, this just the sort of, I need you, you need me, this essential interconnectedness that we have. So they told her, you have to give them something back, but it can't be equivalent in value, because if it is, you're saying, I don't want anything to do with you. I don't want, I don't want there to be tension. I don't want to be needed by you. I don't want you to need me. So it's like the very precondition of our entire existence, where everything has to be this is, supposedly equivalent exchange. It's like completely retrograde to how humans lived and dealt with each other for, I'll say 100,000 years, something like that. I don't know the exact, number of years, how long it was before money and basically this form of reciprocity was introduced. But it's inherently violent, and it's inherently antisocial, because it's like, I don't need you. You don't need me. I'm separate unto myself. I'm my own tribe. I'm my own village. I'm not a part of this. I'm not a part of you. I don't want you to need me, and I don't want to need you.
What's fascinating about that point, Zach, is, if we're going to start our discussion with human nature, as we know, human beings are social animals, right? We understand each other and the world through our own social connections. And so this market logic that separates and tries to sort of disembed us from social relationships with each other is probably the most anti-human nature form of organization you can think of, right? This whole market of quid pro quo, I give you this, you give me that, and I'll see you later when I need something else again. That is just against every aspect of what makes us human beings. We need this human connection to survive. I mean, all the studies of people that have been in isolation, right? I mean, it literally prevents your brain from developing, prevents your physical being from developing by being socially isolated. So in that sense, you could see how the market is actually against everything that we may even refer to as human nature.
I thought it was interesting too. Another thing I'd like to kind of add on to what Zach was saying a minute ago with David Graeber. I was reading his book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, not too long ago also. And it was kind of interesting also how much he related honor with the debt.
That doesn't sound familiar. That doesn't sound like a Hollywood
really
movie at all.
Something that's just kind of been lost, essentially, in modern society, as far as, honoring your fellow human being, your neighbors, your friends and family, the earth, and things like that. 1,000 years ago, several thousand years ago, especially, I think there was a tale of, I don't know, somebody, they were vying for Achilles' sword. I think it was after he had died. I forget who the characters exactly were, but the person who wasn't chosen went and killed himself because he felt like it was just such a disgrace to not hold that honor, to be a good enough person, to be chosen to have Achilles' sword. And now it's like the sword would be auctioned off, and there's no honor essentially involved in it anymore, but to auction something in that day would literally be an insult, and they would not want it at any type of price. It was literally all about character, your honor, how good of a person you were, how worthy you were to receive a gift or be bestowed with something like that. And it just kind of goes to show you the whole mindset beneath it all as well. We've lost that honor for ourselves, for humanity, for reverence for each other, for nature, respect, things like that. And that was kind of one of the main essences, I think, that I gained out of that book too, is, capitalism and just having a number value system on everything like that, it strips it all away, and now everything is just about profit. How much can we, profit can we extract out of the earth or out of our environment or our fellow human beings? And if it makes dollars, then it makes sense. And honor is nowhere in the equation anymore, essentially.
So speaking of the profit system that infinitely reduces us in this quantified endless reduction where we chip away at each other forever. I'm curious to ask you this, Jeff, because it's something I kind of struggle to articulate because it like pulsates with this malevolent electrical intensity of complexity and insanity of this whole basically how the money system works today with the fractional reserve banking and how all that came to be, and how, you know, the Federal Reserve, like I was talking to somebody the other day about all this stuff, and they just kept asking, like, wait, what is the Federal Reserve? What is that? And I just had to keep describing it like it was this Lovecraftian, like, cult that lives underground and, like, you know, pulls demons up out of the ground and puts them into coins and things like that. It's so dark and scary and weird. And I would love if you could help elucidate just how illusory this sort of system is, how made up it is.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time sort of going down the rabbit hole of the Federal Reserve, and that was a fun, good time. But, you know, the story of the Federal Reserve would go further back, I would say, than 1913, but I think 1913 is a good starting point, just because at that particular moment when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, you know, interesting about that Federal Reserve Act when it first came into existence in 1913, it got passed on December 23rd, which was, you know, most people that were in Congress when they were getting ready to vote on it actually.
Sorry about that there. Sorry about that. I accidentally muted you when I was trying to unmute myself.
Oh, okay.
I apologize.
He wants me to shut up right now. So.
Like, no, we don't talk about that. Sorry, go ahead. My bad.
We don't want to get Kennedy'd on this show. We don't want to talk about the Federal Reserve too much.
That's right.
A bullet is just going to whiz through all of our windows.
That's right. Simultaneously.
Well, you know what I tell my students is that the Federal Reserve is neither federal nor does it have any reserves, right? And if you read on their website, they say they are independent within the government, which is an interesting way to think about how they perceive themselves. Because the monetary policy that Federal Reserve chairmen get to make, they don't have to have approval from anybody in the government.
It's like unaccountable, basically, also. I don't think they really answer to anybody either.
No, they don't. No, they don't. The only thing that happens is that chairman of the Federal Reserve Board is elected by the president. The president picks them. And that's the part that gets them sort of like connected to the government. But the rest of that monetary policy is completely independent from whatever is going on politically. Like they can make decisions on interest rates and how much they're loaning out. And they literally sit in a room in a round table. It sounds really silly. It sounds like very conspiratorial, but they literally sit at a round table and decide interest rates. They basically decide how expensive money is in the world, which controls quite a bit. It sounds like a fiction novel. It does. I mean, the way it's all set up sounds like a fiction novel, but it actually is quite true. But I don't know where you want me to start with it. I mean, the Federal Reserve is such a weird entity, but essentially they have this magic wand where they can create money out of thin air. They create it through loans, which means they create it through debt. And the fascinating part about that is if you have a money system where every single dollar that's created has an equal amount of debt attached to it, then any discussion of paying debts off literally means removing money from society. And that isn't even accounting for any interest that may be added to pay back any debts that they say that you need to pay back from these loans. So if you add interest on top of that, that means there's always going to be more debt than money. Meaning if you have an entire society based on a monetary system that has more debt than money, bankruptcies are inevitable, right? So it's literally an elaborate game of musical chairs where we're all competing with each other over a scarce resource, money, which is a fictitious commodity, doesn't even exist in our physical reality, for which there isn't enough to go around for everybody. It's manufactured mathematically that way, but it keeps people showing up to work and being so busy with their lives they can't think about how all this stuff works. So it is a massive form of social control, and it was like that. It was designed that way from its very beginning.
In this completely disjointed, disconnected, competitive world, we are unified under the use of money. That all societies all over the world, just about, unless there's some uncontacted, isolated tribe that will shoot you with arrows if you try to come close and bring your, your monetary germ. We are all we're unified under this metric. We're unified in it. It's completely dominated the entire earth. I would say without firing a shot, But, as we all know, many shots have been fired to maintain this, that it was not voluntary. It was not, they didn't give people a choice. You can continue doing society the way you do, or you can use our money. It was like, no, you have to use this. You have to do this. And it's this absolutely, honestly, ingenious control mechanism where people will control themselves. They will compete with each other for this scarce made up resource, this little token, this thing that doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't have any use or value. You can't eat it. You can't, make things with it. It's just basically a power token, a control token. And we're completely dominated by it everywhere, all over the world. It is super malevolent.
I said that to a student recently, Zach, and they said, well, you can use money for something. You could wipe your ass with the dollar bills. And I was like, oh, well, that'd be a good use for it.
Even that sounds painful. It's kind of like not even really suited towards that. Like, it's like you could if you were like in a really in a cramp, like I suppose.
I was just going to interject a buzzword or a key term. Essentially, I'm the one that likes to try and make sure that the people that are just now tuning in and trying to wrap their heads around these concepts that we're discussing in depth understand what we're saying, and that perhaps they have some kind of anchor. I know that coercion is a word that's thrown around a lot now. And so I just wanted to highlight the fact that is exactly what Jeff and Marlo just expanded on. And quite well, very comprehensively.
Nice. So one thing that I'm curious sorry if I cut you guys off or anything there. As a sociology professor, I'm very curious, to hear what your opinions are on the best actions that people could take to try to start moving in the direction of a moneyless society, or, people who are familiar with Zeitgeist movement, Venus Project, we would call it more resource-based economy, things like that. A couple of the books I've read lately, they really emphasize kind of like grassroots movements, like essentially from the ground up a lot of the time. There's a couple movements recently, I think, like BLM, Black Lives Matter, is been formed kind of large parts from the ground up, kind of a grassroots essential sort of thing. And a couple of the books I've read lately have just really emphasized the importance of having that kind of as a base. But I'm curious, what does that look like in a movement like this? And also, do you think it's that important, or is change, as massive as we're talking about, is that going to be more from a policy level or both? Or, what do you think? What are the most important aspects that people could do right now to start moving in that direction?
Yeah, no, that's a super good question. The first thing I always say is that everybody's situation is different. So what I can do to help that transition probably looks different than what you can do. But the first thing I always say is that we're not going to be able to fight a system in which we don't understand. And so I know that the first step, which is often the most frustrating answer, is that we need more education. And that's part of the reason why I am an educator, is because that people aren't going to want a different system if they can't even conceptualize what a different system would look like. So we do need to educate ourselves in how the system came about, what its deficiencies are, and why it is something we need to try to move away from. And once you kind of get that under your belt, then I think there's a lot that can be done personally. So, for example, what I have been trying to do is try to limit the amount of money I actually need to survive. And there's a number of different ways you can do that. And usually people bring up things like growing your own food, which I think is fantastic in many ways. But there is something that I plan on personally trying to do myself. And I want to challenge anybody who's in a similar position as me that can do this, which is a bit of a privileged position on my part. But I'm going to be trying to actually create and store my own power. And I think if I can really get a good system on how to get that done and remove myself from having to continue to pay the power bill, that's going to be huge in my ability to start stepping out of this system and show other people how that we can start separating ourselves from needing this system. Because ultimately, this system spread by taking away all the means in which we were able to survive without it. And once it took all those systems away, then we relied on this system to survive. And we're going to have to start making the transition back away from it. in a way in which doesn't revert us back to some, like, I don't want everybody living in tents as an example, right? I'm not talking about going to some primitive hunter-gatherer society from where we're at today, but we're going to have to try to develop systems for which we are all not reliant on the very system that is exploiting us and the environment for profit. So there's a number of different ways we can all accomplish that.
Nice.
But
I think that sounds exactly like a lot of the things that we talk about doing long term here too, is essentially creating systems that allow us to step outside of the for-profit model for, like you said, generating power, food, clothing, housing, vehicles, other things like that. And I think the more people can come together and really start creating solid systems that actually do that, and actually start manufacturing our own goods too, with equal ownership, more like cooperative based business models, to where everybody essentially owns part of the business and owns, the means of production and whatnot. And it's more democratically distributed and decided what's going to be produced and things like that. Those are a lot of the systems that we kind of eventually see being more of a transition to that. Maybe with multiple cooperatives working together, you can eventually have a system that provides workers or, consumers within those cooperatives with, say, universal basic goods and services or universal basic necessities, instead of just like a universal basic income. Right now, we're actually giving people what they need to survive. And that, in my opinion, would probably eliminate, a large portion of, what they would need in expenditures as far as, monthly bills and things like that. And if you can start to get pockets of communities, together, working with people working together like that to produce their own goods, provide their own electricity, then you can start, I think, to have a basis for a transition. If you get enough people and communities and cooperatives and whatnot kind of working together, that's kind of what I would envision, what we end up talking a lot about. It's kind of the subject we end up evolving into with a lot of these conversations, it seems to me. I kind of wanted to get your take on that too. I think Zach has something to add also, probably.
I was just going to say that I was listening to this talk the other day, and he said that corporations have existed for about 150 years as we know them. And that just really made me think, like, wow, that's really not a long time. And he was saying that corporations were this formulation, this sort of social arrangement where people come together in a group, collectivize, really, and it makes them a lot harder to rein in. It makes them a lot harder to control. It makes them harder. It's a lot harder to hold a group of people accountable to societal standards than it is for others. And I think the American Constitution is all about business. It's all about, empowering business owners. I mean, that was the intention of this nation. What was like, okay, king's not in charge, business people are. The people who own property are, propertarians, as Bookchin said. His word for libertarians is funny.
That's funny.
Those are the people that have the power in this society. And as we see in the short period of time that this nation has existed, the corporation has come to dominate. And it's interesting, we have this super individualistic culture, but the corporation is collectivist. Jeff Bezos, maybe he's the head of Amazon, but he's just the tyrannical figurehead. There's a ton of people bringing all their resources together into these corporations, and that's what makes them powerful. Even one person, if he had $1 billion, can't do shit. You need people. And I think one of the most powerful things we can do, and it's a fundamental thing, it's a profound thing, is take the wealth and resources that we all have together individually and pool them collectively. So it's like making a stew pot. Somebody's got a carrot, somebody's got a potato, somebody's got some broth, somebody's got a stick of butter. Everybody brings something together, and when that pot is full, everybody eats until they are more than full, and there's leftovers for days. Every time, it's a miraculous kind of alchemical synthesis that happens when people come together and share things. And I think that's really what we need to do. We need to, you start with food production, the basics. Everybody eats. Then you move up to energy production. Robert Shields was talking about this. Our good friend Robert Shields, who just ran for mayor of Fairbanks, Alaska. You start with food, then you move up to energy, just like you're saying, Jeff. And then, like what Matt's saying, then you move up to creating all the other things you need. Clothes, products,
electronics, whatever. I mean, and then I think it's all about taking the money that we do have, sourcing it, kind of crowdsourcing those small amounts, and then turning them into permanent infrastructure, turning them into things that basically bring us to that kind of zero marginal cost of life, where life doesn't cost anything. You have solar panels, they essentially last for about 10 years. You have 10 years of power, and that power that you generate through that, it can circulate and it can grow. And that's what I see. And I think the larger macrocosmic vision is like, we should all collectively be investing in infrastructure that makes life free, or as close to free as we can get, till that cost gets lower and lower and lower, where we don't need any more inputs, where we're just creating this, societal infrastructure that just basically makes things free and automated.
As I was listening to you talk, Zach, I was actually thinking, oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Amanda.
Oh, no, it's not nearly as important. I was just going to sum up what Zachary said as the bridge analogy that I use sometimes. Obviously, what we is building those steps one at a time. And each thing that he mentioned is basically a phase of that transition. And to conceptualize it or try to visualize it, you've got the world that we live in today, the globe, and then you have the bridge that's being built plank by plank, extending out to the new world that will support us and be sustainable. And it's not impossible. That's exactly how the world we know today was built. That's how the infrastructure that we experience today was built, was one step and one phase at a time.
Well, but like Jeff said, unintentionally, it was unintentionally done. It wasn't designed. It wasn't planned. It was just hobbled together, mishmash, this here, this here, this here. It wasn't for a purpose. We live in a for-profit dystopia, and like these are your words, Amanda, that we live in a for-profit dystopia when we could be living in a for-purpose utopia, just a world that is intentional, a world that, many worlds could exist within this framework all over the world, localized, custom to every location, to every locality. The people that live there can actually design it. It doesn't have to be this sort of centralized, unified thing, as long as it's unified along the actual, human value system and the ecological value system, that it's sustainable, that it contributes to human wellness, human growth, and to the flourishing of our ecosystem.
Just one more thing,
Jeff, you were going to say something there.
Oh, no, go ahead.
We're never going to let you
know. No, go.
We're all chomping at the bit. I was just going to say how every time he says something about how unintentionally designed our society is today, it reminds me of the oil rigs that are still present today, 200 years later, 150 years later, in the neighborhoods of California, because sometime long ago, some white guy that wanted some oil thought that'd be a good idea. And so they just left them there, and they're still in use, and they're camouflaged by paintings and school buildings.
Well, something I was just thinking about when Zach was talking is that when we start talking about transition steps, I think there's going to be a major hurdle that I think a lot of people have talked about, but it's just something I just want to bring up just because I've been talking to my classes a lot about this. One of the major hurdles that we're going to have to really take seriously is the amount of psychological warfare that's going on. And what I mean by that specifically in this case is we have an entire industry that we call advertising that was essentially invented the way that we think about it today after World War I. And this propaganda machine of glorifying commodities to us in these ways that appeal to our emotions and don't appeal to any sort of utilitarian aspect of whatever the commodity is something that has gotten so much steam and so much momentum at this point that to think about unwinding the sort of psychological damage that this has been doing to human beings, especially people in the United States over time, is something that we really are going to have to address and wrap our mind around. There's plenty of studies that talk about the ways in which people who had never been exposed to advertising before were fairly happy individuals. And then after they were exposed to it for a while, they've done studies showing that they have increasing amounts of depression and negative feelings about themselves. And all of this sort of ways in which the advertising industry that was developed after World War I really is psychologically damaging to us, that I don't know how we're going to unwind it, but we're going to have to figure out some way of doing it if we're going to progress as a human species on this planet.
Well, I actually think that it seems so dooming and damning when you read that stuff, and that's like the real conspiracy in our world, is that when we had the productive capacity to create abundance, people who were, own factories and then were invested in them, the capitalist class said, there are fucking memos and recordings and writings of people saying, we need people to buy more stuff than they need. We need to make them dissatisfied. They literally said this. Like, there are records. We got receipts.
Paul Mazur, a Lehman Brothers executive, wrote a book called like American Prosperity. Like, I think that's the name of the book. And where he says that specifically, that we need to foster dissatisfaction in the world because they could produce and distribute huge amount of resources and commodities all around the world, but consumption rates were so low that they couldn't find the demand for how much they could produce. So they literally invented this advertising machine, which the head of that is Edward Bernays. If anybody isn't familiar with Edward Bernays, I would definitely look him up. But he is somebody that literally invented this whole system of manipulating people's subjective emotional understandings about who they are to sell them commodities.
So it seems scary and dooming to think about that, but when you really see how quickly people's minds were changed on a mass cultural level from being relatively happy, consistent, not over consuming. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to make this show about human nature, because so many times we talk about this stuff, people will say, oh, well, humans are greedy, or, oh, humans are, we'll take more than we need. The tragedy of the commons, people will take more than they need because people are greedy. People are not greedy. And we can see before advertising, we did not have a consumer culture. People did not place their importance in things nearly to the degree that we do today. And that was intentional. That was created in a very short amount of time. And I think if we can gain control of all forms of the means of production, the means of production of media, the means of production of music and movies and culture, we need to seize this technology and utilize it better than the people who are controlling it on this mass level and, jamming this worldview down people's throats. That we can change people's minds in a very short amount of time. People look at the world and you see people glued to their cell phones, and, you see the rampant consumerism and people going shopping for fun and, destroying themselves. And, you got videos on YouTube of like people in the woods, like just blowing things up for fun and, taking pride in their truck's exhaust. And you just think like, man, how are we ever going to get it together? But then you also see like people are such followers, how are we going to get it together? But it's like people are followers. That's it. That's kind of like the silver lining here, is that people will follow, that the nature of our nature is not to be constrained by our nature. Even though we do all these things that are destructive to us, we are hackable. We're adaptive. Infinitely adaptive. We can adapt to any circumstance. And any person that you see in the world today that you think might be stupid or backwards or caught in the old ways, they don't take it for granted. If there's enough social pressure, they will change, because we are hardwired to, unless you have a lot of money and you neurologically stop registering the emotions of other people, and you're less empathetic. Jeff, can you kind of speak to that? Because that's not just like rich people bad. That's this is neurology. This is a science of how money affects our brains, how power and money affect us.
Yeah, there's some really interesting work in social psychology done by a guy named Paul Piff and another guy named Decker. I believe his last name is Decker. Anyways, they've done some really interesting studies where they found that it isn't so much that horrible people end up being rich. It's that once you get a certain amount of wealth, it ends up making you mean, in the sense that it ends up actually reducing the amount of empathy you have for other people. They have these elaborate games of Monopoly, which I'm sure maybe some people have already heard of, but they have these rigged game of Monopoly where they'll have two people that are playing, and by the flip of a coin, one person gets to roll with 2 dice and one person gets to roll with 1 dice. One person gets to collect $200 when they pass go, one person does not. And as they continue to play the game, the obvious thing starts to happen, right? One person starts to get all of the property and all of the money. But once they start doing that, they have all these interesting behaviors. Like they start actually smashing the chips of the board pieces on the board harder. They start eating more food. That's like the bowl of pretzels they have on the side. They start eating more pretzels as they start getting more money. They start being more rude to the other player. And then by the very end of it, they end up attributing their success to their own ability to play the game, not the fact that the game was rigged and they just by chance got an extra set of privileges that the other person got. So there's tons of studies that are like that showed basically money itself, and the more money we have ends up reducing our actual empathy for other human beings. And that's why I say things like the market are probably the one thing that human beings have created and are perpetuating that is truly against who we really are and how we can actually flourish in this world, which is fascinating because the exact opposite argument is made by economists. That the only way to flourish is to give people jobs and to give them money and to get them, as they say, out of poverty. When we know for a fact that the only reason why you are suffering in poverty is because you're forced to live in a system based on this economic thought process to begin with, right? So I don't know how much more you want me to expand on that, but there's so many different studies by social psychologists that just go over this over and over and over again. Even people like Alfie Cohen. Alfie Cohen's a great person to look up. He wrote a book called Punished by Rewards. And he would talk about how the mere fact of giving somebody an extrinsic reward actually prevents people from thinking deeper about problems and actually ends up reducing their ability to have creative thinking processes, because the more in which you are focused on this extrinsic reward of money, the less you're focused on the project at hand. And there's just, I mean, it's such a plethora amount of research done on that. A guy named Daniel Pink wrote a book called Drive, who makes the same argument, which ironically, he's a capitalist himself, and he comes to this conclusion that is one of the most anti-capitalist conclusions you can come to, which is that extrinsic rewards do not promote innovation. But that's what's being promoted throughout society, right? That we're going to have money in markets. And
the beginning of that book, there's a great quote, and it's from the people who did one of the first studies on extrinsic motivations. And it says, it's basically like they're talking about their findings after they did this test on like, okay, we give people money to do these tasks and yeah, they're going to do it better, right? They said like, I love this quote so much. It's like we did an experiment where we rolled a ball bearing down a slope, and to our great surprise, it flew up into the air, suggesting that the fundamental gravity of the way that we think that the world is motivated, it doesn't work. So yeah, I mean, I just read that book, and he breaks it down through countless studies that just say like there is only like one instance where giving people monetary reward makes them better at what they're doing, and that's just a blindly repetitive task. And I can actually speak personally to that. I used to trim weed. I used to go out to the cannabis growing region of Northern California and trim weed every season. I would help harvest it and do all that stuff, but then you have to trim it up, and you're just sitting there mindlessly cutting it with scissors for hours, but you get paid based on how much you produce. So I was like, okay, great. And that's people all over the world would come out there and do that because you can work under the table. You can make like $100 a day, or, there's no cap really. The cap is how much you work. So I would work like 14 hours a day, and most of the people there would you just work really hard. And I became really fixated on the money. Only time in my life I've ever been motivated by money, even though, I make movies, I'm good at it. I could be making, 10 grand a commercial, 30 grand a commercial for 3 days of work. I have no motivation to do that because I don't care about the money. But when it was like, the more you work, the more money you get, that was very motivating. But those kinds of jobs are being automated now, and technological unemployment is inevitable. They will be automated as soon as they can, make it more cost effective, and they should be, again and again, we keep coming back to the central tier point. The central transition step is like, I think getting people, and especially in like the labor movements, to understand we don't have to work like this. We can automate away all this work. We don't need to work for money to live. And the money itself is not the best motivator. And Amanda has had her finger up for like 10 minutes. I'm sorry.
It's really okay. And I know that it's definitely time to hear from Matt again. But I just had to point out something that you got very close to explaining and highlighting there, Jeff. I personally could do a whole show on demystifying corruption. You pointed out how, the more money someone gets, inevitably it's going to change who they are. And what happens is people moralize that argument, and they're all like, oh, but if you're a good person, you'll always be a good person. And so people are mystified by this conception of becoming corrupt just because you have more money than another person. But that's just the inherent mechanisms. That's how it works. If you live in a society where you don't have to reciprocate, and you can be independent with enough money, then obviously you're not going to reach out and be the social being you were born if you can live on your own without others' help. And then also, to go back just a little further, you were talking about engineered demand. And what popped in my mind was another phrase is FOMO, fear of missing out. That's essentially what that guy created. And that has created like nearly incomprehensible myriad of social issues, right down to like intimate relationship issues. People, might miss out on a better partner, to what kind of house, what kind of car, what kind of food, what kind of clothes you have, what kind of school you go to, just because we've been exposed to all these options that are instantaneously at our fingertips that may or may not even be necessary. But anyway, I'm sorry, Matt, what did you have to say?
No, I didn't have anything to say. I was just laughing. It's okay. Although I did have a question too. I was just curious also if you had read the book or heard of the book Survival of the Friendliest. I thought that was interesting book. I haven't read it all the way through, but I know like who was it? Herbert Spencer, I think, kind of bastardized the survival of the fittest, whole thing, and that kind of I think some of his research was kind of the basis for all that. But there was a book that came out not too long ago, I think, called Survival of the Friendliest, where they kind of go back and debunk some of that too. So just curious if you had heard of that and what your thoughts were also.
I haven't heard of that book. That sounds like a very interesting read, but yes, that is absolutely true that Herbert Spencer created the term survival of the fittest, right? Because Darwin was talking about species best able to adapt to their environment live to breed another day, right? Like that was what his suggestion was. It had nothing to do with glorifying competition, right? He's like, species compete and also cooperate to survive, depending on what the circumstances are. But the one thing I was thinking about when Zach was talking was that these incentives that we talk about, extrinsic rewards, one of the things that they are really, really, really good at is motivating people to do things they don't want to do for means they don't agree with. And in that sense, money is one of the greatest forms of coercion and manipulation that has ever been created. And I think that is also missed because people don't often think about that. They think about money as something that gives them freedom. But essentially, money is a way to control and restrict the freedom of others to gain access to the things they need to survive, because if they don't give that piece of money, they don't get access to it. So it is not a form of freedom. It is the greatest form of delusion and social coercion that has ever been created or perpetuated by humanity.
Right. And I think that's a great point too. And it was something that we were talking about earlier too. In order for them to really be, part of the economy and the workforce, they have to be free, which means they have to be free, from labor from another person. They also have to be free from the means to subsist, meaning like free from ownership of land or any kind of means of production. And then they can be coerced into working for wages, essentially. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, it's. I've been reading a bit about the history of wage labor and how maligned it's been through history. That it's like wage labor is slavery. I mean, and all through history, it's been treated that way. And it's like, even in like the 1800s, around like Lincoln's time, where that Marxist rhetoric was really permeating American politics, where they're talking about how labor creates value and the dignity of the worker and all this stuff. And they're speaking out against wage labor, and it's this document that's like it's like one of those conspiratorial little documents you find where you're like, are people actually conspiring to control our society? I'm trying to find it, what it is. The Hazard Circular. Slavery is likely to be abolished by the war power and chattel slavery destroyed. This I and my European friends are in favor of, for slavery is but the owning of labor and carries with it the care of the laborer. While the European plan, led on by England, is capital control of labor by controlling wages. This can be done by controlling the money.
That was in, I first saw that in Zeitgeist Addendum, and I had forgotten the name of that title to that document. But that was where I first saw it, was in Zeitgeist Addendum in that movie.
Yeah, it's so interesting the back and forth we go between, where it's like, is this intentional? Are there people pulling the strings? Is there like an articulated conspiracy of people like the Rockefellers and things like that making things happen? Because I find horrible quotes from John D. Rockefeller every time his name comes up. It's like he said something the other day. It was like it was like, the best time to invest is when the streets run red with blood. Like the things this motherfucker said. He said, we don't want a nation of thinkers. We want a nation of workers, and like there's people who at all turns who have sought to control society, and it's interesting to me. I just feel like those people are clearly the most controlled by money. They're the most controlled by it, that they would actually sacrifice true self-interest of creating flourishing habitats, like the whole Malthusian mandate, the whole Malthusian thing of like, we want to make things worse so more poor people die, so that there'll be less, there'll be more resources for everybody, that people will literally destroy their habitat on purpose or just knowingly do it to continue, making profit in the interim.
There's a philosophical history behind that too, Zach. If you read, because I was forced to read a lot of economic history in my grad school.
Forced.
Some of it was pretty horrible. Like, honestly, I didn't want to read Malthus again. I didn't want to read Adam Smith again, but I had to. But anyways, so when you're reading this kind of stuff, what you find out is that there was a point in history when classical economists, they actually perceived the market as being subordinate to the needs of society. And then there was this shift that happened right at the end of the 18th century, where people like Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo and Adam Smith, they flipped that on its head. And they now saw the world as society's needs being submissive to the needs of the market, which was a complete reversal of the way people used to think about it. And in that sense, it created what John McMurtry would call the market as God, right? And so once they made that philosophical switch in their minds, then you have people like Thomas Malthus who are advocating bringing back the plague to reduce the amount of people in society. So that history is fascinating as far as how it changed mentally between people's minds, because the market really was something that was peripheral to most people's lives. It was something they really only dealt with in small areas of their life. It wasn't encompassing everything about their life like it is today. And it was that psychological switch with classical economists, for which we now call neoclassical economists, in the rhetoric and the literature when you read it. That switch is really that moment where capitalism really took off and really developed into what it is today, where we think that everything should have a price on it, and everything should be subjective to the competitive whims of the market. And that just really wasn't even embedded even in economists' minds prior to that moment. So it is actually a fascinating history, and that history started not that long ago, relatively, right?
Well, I think it really just overall, it speaks to the fluidity and the adaptivity of us, that we change very quickly, and little ripples through human consciousness can just go so far. So I think I kind of want to shift gears to talking about kind of doing that more intentionally, and your experience with Jacques Fresco and, Zeitgeist Movement, the Venus Project, because I know you, we talk all the time. I know you have a great story, a very personal, beautiful story of the ways that these conceptualities changed your life, changed the way you think, changed your amount of hope in humanity, that we can change things.
Yeah. Well, the quote I always say about Jacques that I usually tell people is, he said something to me in person that I'm sure you could find a recording of this, right? But he said it to me in person, and it just stuck with me forever. He just said that every single person is perfectly well adjusted from where they are coming from. And in that sense, he was talking about trying to communicate with different people from different backgrounds. He's somebody that was able to turn around a Ku Klux Klan group in Florida, as an example, and a White Citizens Council group. And so if he was able to do that, the amount of people that we say are impossible to change, I think he has proven that to be wrong. It's just our tactics that we use are what needs to be changed on how we communicate with people who are thinking like this. But my personal story with Jacques is just, I found myself at 30 years old. I had two children. They were 3 and 5 years old at the time. And I, at that moment in my life, had just gotten broken up with the mother of my children. She essentially disappeared. We didn't see her for a few years. So it was just me and my 2 kids. And I had to start my life over, essentially, the long and short of that story. And I was just struggling to find jobs that fulfilled me. I was stuck in many, many dead-end jobs, blue-collar entry jobs, from truck driving to construction jobs. And I finally decided that one day I was going to pursue the job that made me the happiest. And so I've always been into martial arts and working out and lifting weights and doing this type of stuff. So I thought I could be a personal trainer, and I thought I could live my own American dream and pursue that. So I read and memorized a 500-page book for the National Academy of Sports Medicine. And I took the test, and it was the first test in my life that I can remember studying for and passing, because in school I intentionally didn't do any work in school. But so I passed this test, and I get to be a personal trainer. And what I found out is that it actually just was a sales job. It was just me trying to sell me to somebody else to get them to pay me to hang out with me. And I just found it so disgusting. I was like, I just want to help people. I wasn't here to try to suck $300 out of you every month and try to figure out what they actually had me taking classes at this gym to try to box people into saying yes. And I remember just being so disgusted by it. But I didn't know why. I didn't know why I was living in this world for which nothing made sense to me. I felt alienated wherever I went. And even the one thing that I thought was going to make me happy in this world was completely destroyed once I tried to make money off of it. And so that's when I fell into watching Zeitgeist Moving Forward. And that documentary, I watched it in 2013 when it came out. And when that documentary came out, I was just like, I just remember walking around in a daze for weeks, like just thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it. And so I just started researching all these people that were in the documentary. Well, obviously one of the people was Jacques Fresco. And when I started learning more about him and what he was saying, it filled all of these holes in my mind that I had since I was a little boy, and that I couldn't figure out why I didn't feel connected with the rest of the world, why I didn't feel connected with everybody, why every time I tried to make my job my passion, it just fell apart. And so I decided at the time that I had to meet him, because I knew he was in his late 90s and he didn't have much time. And I don't have a good explanation for what compelled me to do it, but I just felt with every essence of my being that I had to meet him in person. So I took every single penny I had left to my name and I bought a round trip ticket to Florida, and I went down there and I met him during one of his Saturday meetings, and listened to him talk for hours, and listened to Roxanne talk. And we went around the whole Venus project, and he showed me all the things he's invented and done. And I was just on a high. I was just like, this is it. Like, this is something, a direction that people don't know about, people aren't listening to, and I need to tell people about it. Well, I started telling people about it when I got back home, and I just got Marxist, communist, socialist, and just all of these like things thrown at me. And at the time, I'd only read a little bit of Marx, right? So I didn't really know what it meant to call me a Marxist. I was just like, for some reason, people think that's what I am now. So anyways, I ended up just learning more about political economy in general, the economics. And I remember taking a lot of free courses on economics after that, just to try to understand why people were attacking me the way they were attacking me. But ultimately, Jacques' inspiration still to this day is the thing that makes me believe that people can be different and that we can create a world that is different than the one we have today. And one in which this exploitation of money and coercion of money doesn't have to exist. And before that, it just wasn't in my mind. Like I would say that it, just like many other people, you just literally can't see outside the box of the monetary market economy. And the moment it broke out of my mind, then my mind was freed. And all of a sudden, I was so thirsty for knowledge after meeting Jacques that I was just reading textbooks for fun. Like I was just immersed in trying to learn and understand. And that's when I was like, I need to go to school, because that's what I would be doing in school anyways. So that's my impetus to go to college, is actually meeting Jacques, which I think a lot of people find pretty interesting. But for me, he cracked open something in my mind that I think was hindering me for a long time. And once that box was cracked open, the floodgates have been open ever since. And I've just been so thirsty for knowledge ever since. And so his inspiration is beyond words in how I can describe to you how he has inspired me to be a better person and to try to change the world to something better.
Okay, I have a probably a real hardball question here, but I think you're actually the best, maybe the best person I know to really answer it. And it's like, how would you explain the kind of world that you want to live in and that we could live in, and sort of the path to that, to say one of these people you worked with on job sites, or to, somebody that is just, somebody whose mind is closed, somebody who is, just the average person walking around this world, who isn't particularly educated, doesn't know the theory behind it, How would you explain, like, what is the world we want to live in? What could we do?
Yeah, well, that is definitely a hardball question, in the sense that it is very difficult to answer depending on who you're talking to, right? And generally,
real quick thing about Jacques, and just actually quick, not a me quick that turns into a 10-minute tangent, but like, the way to talk to people is to speak their language, no matter what, no matter who they are and where they're coming from. You know, just to be able to speak someone's language is super therapeutic. And I just think that's a really important thing, is to realize everybody's coming from a certain place and we have to meet them where they are. We can't throw these concepts and terms and things at them and just expect them to get them and then get angry when they don't. But yeah, go ahead.
Well,
What is the world that we could be living in?
I was going to say, you basically said probably what I was going to say. So that's how I approach the people I talk to, is I try to come at them from where they're coming from. When we're talking about a different system, and especially a resource-based economy, I think Jacques' metaphor of understanding how the human body works is the best way to approach it, because that is literally how he designed a resource-based economy, was the ways in which the human body functions. And so this is where we start getting into things like systems theory, right, Matt? Because what Jacques was talking about is that if we want a city that works, it's going to have to be a viable system. And any viable system is going to have some sort of equilibrium. And the system that we have today is based on infinite growth, and we have a finite planet, and these resources regenerate at a certain rate, and the economic system we have today doesn't respect that. Matter of fact, it goes out of its way to exploit it at ever-increasing faster speeds and more devastating consequences. But essentially, Jacques would use the metaphor that, if your liver said, I'm the most important organ, and your brain said, no, I am, and I want to go a free enterprise system, you'd rot away in a month if your body operated within this capitalist logic. And so we're going to have to find a way to create an economic system that has dynamic equilibrium, meaning we're going to have to find some sort of balance with the other life on this planet for which we all depend on. And any economic system that doesn't try to find balance, a steady state balance with the resources of this planet, is doomed to fail. You might be interested, just on a side tangent. I am teaching a class called the Sociology of Communication right now.
Yeah.
I'm teaching the class on the history of mass media communications over the last 100 years.
I just picked up a book on the anthropology of media that I'm excited to read, and I bet you'd have some good input on that.
Yeah.
Your testimony was so cathartic. Like, I can so relate. As an artist, after I tried pushing myself and selling myself, I was like, forget it. I just wanted to paint, not sell myself to people, in order to sell my paintings. But anyways, and also you're making some really great, profound points, and you're making them easily digestible. This is maybe by far my favorite conversation we've had.
Oh, well, I take that as a huge compliment. Thank you.
You made me wish I really met Jacques Fresco too. It sounds like that was a really cool experience.
It's like I said, it was so beyond describing. Like, I actually wrote an article about my experience for the Venus Project, and they had posted it on their online magazine. And their online magazine was up for years. And this guy, Theo Trom, was actually the one running it.
Right.
Eventually, they had a falling out, and they took that magazine down, and my article went with it. So that was an unfortunate. But it was one of those moments where I really hadn't ever written anything. I know that sounds very strange, but I was able to actually go through all the way to high school with never really writing a paper. No, I really was funny. Like super anti-school. I had all kinds of books I was reading and dealing with, but I just had nothing to do with school. I hated it.
And now you're a professor. Lovely.
No, and I talked to the students about that, because I'm like, some of the ways I'm organizing this class is the way I is the opposite of what I hated about school.
Awesome.
Because I don't just sit in front of the class and just start lecturing. Like, I have things that I have us learning about, and then we sit in groups and discuss it. And I look eye to eye with my students, right? Like, I'm not looking up at them and down at them and looking at everybody. And I want to get in their face. I want to get close to them. I want to see how they're taking this information. I want to read their body language. And I want to make sure that this is something we are all embarking on, not something I am making you embark on.
Yeah, that's great.
It's comforting to know that someone like you is out there teaching the youth.
You should see my students' faces. We're only halfway through the semester, and my students are just like blown away with what I've shown them so far.
That's awesome.
But I'm getting ready to show them about Operation Gladio. Have any of you ever heard of Operation Gladio?
No, I haven't heard of that. What's that?
Oh man, it's this operation that the CIA was involved in, that essentially they were creating provocateurs to go in and look like they were communists, and to act like they were communists, and then to go do something horrible to make communists look bad.
Really?
All over.
So to further propagandize the Red Scare.
Yeah, but it was a what they would call black ops.
Exasperate that.
Right. Yeah. So all of these things for which they have plausible deniability for, but which they are stoking all kinds of dissent. And so I'm showing that the students that this is something that's happened over years. And let me show you some contemporary examples.
Awesome.
So we have contemporary examples that are going on today where they actually had this guy from a right-wing group called the Boogaloos. He admitted in court that he dressed up as a Black Lives Matter supporter and started smashing windows. And he actually brought a gun and was shooting it at a police station, saying things like Black Lives Matter and support for George Floyd. And he was doing all of these things as if he was this left winger, when in fact he was a part of right-wing groups doing this on purpose to frame quote unquote Antifa, which is a whole other subject. But anyways, that's a tangential. Sorry.
The links they go to, it's amazing some of the links they go to these days to, I think, demonize the left, essentially. I mean, I think a lot of people are afraid, so they have to go out of their way now to make it look bad. I think that's kind of what's happening. There's so much information out there now that the right is very afraid of everybody really finding out the truth, the big lie, the conspiracy that we've basically been had by capitalism for the last, several hundred years, and that the cat's out of the bag now, and they're scrambling to try to put the cat back in the bag with all this lies and disinformation and everything else. And, there's a lot of people that are falling for it, hook, line, and sinker, especially in the United States, unfortunately. But I think it's only a matter of time, I think, and hopefully until some of that, information comes to light. But we'll see. I mean, who knows? There's a lot of talk of like Trump getting reelected now in 2024 and fascism and all this other stuff. And I'm just like, oh my God, like this is just... You can't be like I swear if Trump gets elected again, I probably will start looking at other options of places, countries to live, because I don't know if I can deal with another 4 years of that. Seriously.
And any student of history will tell you too that if you look at when economic systems, especially the kind that we have, start to disintegrate, that's when the right-wing despots come into power. Right. When people get really, really scared and really, really worried, they start looking for somebody to come in and fix the whole thing. And so that is really the danger of where we're at now, because as you said, right, the cat's out of the bag. Like the economic system we have today just simply does not work. And what scares me is that throughout history, we have generally fallen back on giving large amounts of power to small groups of people, even one particular person, when we are deeply scared and worried and in deep economic disparity. So it is a scary moment we're in.
There's the impulse, to ask for daddy. And I think that's, I just watched a really great video by St. Andrew, one of my favorite YouTubers, about the mind of authoritarianism. And it was absolutely fascinating video breakdown based on some really interesting studies on what it is that makes people turn authoritarian. And it's basically like having this fearful worldview and, desiring like a strong leader to come in and fix it. And it was very chilling listening to these descriptions of people and being able to see that in people, being able to see this behavior in so many people and even people, within the left, that they want an authoritarian regime. And, that there's people I know that would call themselves, leftists or whatever. They're actually calling for and spending their free time arguing for authoritarianism. Oh, we need authoritarianism. We just need left authoritarianism. And I just think that's so sad and pathetic to me that people are so wounded and we're so inculcated in this victimized sensibility where we're so beaten down by this system and its abusive cycle that it is us in so many ways. So many people can't imagine anything beyond it. And they see the actions of the people that are in power and they can't see why. They can't see that there's something deeper than a personal human failure. They can't see that they're actually just perfectly adapted to the environment that they were raised in. They can't see that they were conditioned to be this way. They just see evil. They just see evil and they see like this dark figure. They see this distorted, black hole that warps everything around it. That's what capitalism is. It's this all devouring thing that bends space-time around it so that like Caitlin Johnstone, I can't think of the exact wording, but she said, what is capitalism? And it's a system where the victims of it are treated as the oppressor. And I think that's so powerful that so many people are, capitalism is obviously fucking the world up unbelievably terribly in so many ways. But there's so many people out there, because we have this coercive mass media manipulation, that they think that, the problem is the left. The problem is leftists. It's Antifa. It's critical race theory. It's all these things that are actually arising as like an antibody to it. That my dad sent me this text the other day. It's really great, like the relationship I have with the old man, because when I first started talking about all this stuff, he was very skeptical of it. He was like, oh, okay, whatever. And now he just sends me these quotes all the time about, like, he says, the human mind treats a new idea the way the body treats a strange protein. It rejects it. And it's like, the metaphor of the vaccination and the furor over vaccination is perfect, because so many people are reacting to, a treatment to a sickness as if it's the sickness. I talked to this girl the other day. She was at a rainbow gathering in France, and there was one person who was vaccinated there, and everybody treated them like they were sick. They were like, you got the vaccine? Are you okay? It's like, people would be like, they wouldn't touch them. They wouldn't come near them. That we are so warped and inverted by this just nonsense logic of this system, that we live within this thing that's beating the hell out of us every day. And we have to just say, oh, no, they're not doing that. I did that. Or, the people that are trying to intervene in the fight, they're the aggressor, And if you hadn't intervened, then they wouldn't have gotten mad and hit me more, or whatever the logic is. There's not logic. It's not logic. It's deep fear and just a crushing of what it is to be human. The human being has just been crushed in so many people that they're not really connected to that anymore. They're not connected to any of the positive aspects of humanity. So they blame themselves. They blame the human being. They say, oh, human nature did this to us, not a made up system that we, haphazardly devised 200 years ago.
It reminds me of that quote by Bucky Fuller in Critical Path. He said, humanity is going to have to learn how to make money or make sense, because the two are mutually exclusive. And I think about that quote all the time, right?
That's great.
Yeah. No, I've quoted that in papers multiple times too, to professors. They always found that quote really interesting. He's somebody that I could talk about for hours and hours and hours too. Bucky's one of the most fascinating figures you could ever learn about, in my mind. But
and as they say, someone that Jacques stood on the shoulders of, in order to further those objectives.
Yeah.
So in brief, what do you? Because I love Bucky Fuller. I think he's one of those people that you read him and he slices through all ideology. Because he has this engineer's mind, that he sees things it's a form of radical common sense. And I think that's what Jacques had, that is so rare and beautiful. That's a radical common sense. It's not an ideology. It's not a belief system. It's not a narrative that you implant over reality. It's reality.
They're being rational, Bucky and Jacques, and it makes them rational according to the system standards.
That common sense, though, right, that you're talking about, that Bucky developed. So he developed that kind of common sense from being blind as a child. I'm not sure if many people understand that, but he couldn't see as a kid. And so, he could see colors and like sort of shapes, but he couldn't see more than like an inch from his face, right? That's why later on in life, you see him with these huge, thick glasses. But when he was growing up, the story he always told is that he was given toothpicks and dried peas, because I guess they give kids that and they tell the kids to build a house with it. Well, all these other kids were building square boxes with it, because every house they'd ever seen was a square box. Well, Bucky, not really ever seeing shapes before, he just started building triangles. And then when he felt the square boxes, he didn't understand why they would build it like that, because it was unstable. He's like, you could use less toothpicks and less peas and make a stronger, stable structure than you could with making this square box. And so that stuck with him for the rest of his life. He thought tactily. He thought materially about things. Even the way he creatively thought about things was in this material fashion. And that's how he sort of like conceived of and helped develop the geodesic dome, which today is still the single strongest structure known to man, using the least amount of material. But he did that because his creative thinking process was built around overdeveloping his tactile sense. So he was able to convey this like new method of thinking about material. Well, actually, in closing, buildings. He thought about them differently than we think about them today. And if you think about it, if we actually started to build, and that's something I always argue, because I worked in the construction industry for years, and they waste like half the material that shows up at a construction site ends up in the trash. So they're not even, it's like one of the most inefficient uses of materials you could possibly think of to build a square box house. But if you think of all the resources we could save if we just started building our buildings in a different way, in a more efficient way. Not everything has to be a square box. And when you build something a square box, obviously it's not aerodynamic. So if a tornado comes or a hurricane comes, it's going to blow it down. But instead of learning from that, after it gets blown down, we build a brand new square box in its place that's just going to get torn down again when another tornado comes.
Don't they call that definition of insanity?
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly how our entire material world has been built around. It's built around these old systems that aren't progressing at all. Like the housing industry, we've been building houses the same way for hundreds of years. But if you look at like these electronics that we're all using right now to talk to each other, every 2 months, there's a new one that comes out that makes the old one obsolete. Like the progress is so fast, but we aren't doing that in housing and in the places that actually, keep our shelter, our organized shelter systems are just these backward old handicraft ways that if we don't free ourselves from that type of thinking, there just really won't be enough resources in the world to house everybody, even though we have more houses than people. But if we keep building things this way, we're going to ruin all of the forests to build these houses, for which we won't even be able to live in because we'll be dead. There'll be no forest anymore.
So in that sort of spirit of projecting that logic of like continually updating technology into our actual enclosure, our environment, which is really the opposite of it should be the opposite of an enclosure. It should be essentially open and changeable and something that adapts to our needs. That's our essential human adaptation. Our nature is it goes from being adapting to our environment to adapting our environment to us. And I think that's the essential sort of premise behind looking at the world in a new way is, we need to stop trying to treat the symptoms of this problem. We need to cut out the tumor of capitalism, of expansion, of endless growth. And we need to align ourselves to our environment and change the environment itself to create an environment that does away with all of these problems. And I think when that hit me, it was so profound because you see the world, you see all the shapes in the world. I'm a spiritual person. I've always been very dissociated from this world. I was put on a lot of psychedelic or psychotropic drugs as a child, like prescription drugs and things like that. So I was always, in my own head and my imagination, and I wasn't really connected to society. And I think that has kind of predisposed me to not thinking it's normal, to being abnormal, to being maladjusted to my environment and being told, you're sick and you're wrong and all these things. So it's like, okay, well, why am I going to go out of my way to reinforce a belief in this thing that when I'm told I'm the problem, when I'm just thinking with my own brain, in that spirit of an adaptive worldview. I mean, I want to talk about basically like socio-cyberneering, which is Jacques' term that he was using in the 70s. And Peter Joseph's term right now is one of his transition steps is digital feedback. And I think I just watched that amazing Jeremy Rifkin lecture, the Third Industrial Revolution, and he talks about the Internet of Things. And I think these are all kind of parallel terms to describe a new way of thinking about intelligent infrastructure. I'm curious what your perspective is on that and how you would sort of explain that as a shift in our human thinking that we really can't wrap our heads around. It's like, I think really simply, like, we have the internet. We don't need all these, not just our housing structures are outdated and, inflexible and brittle, but our power structures our social organizational structures are. And it seems like, with the internet and with the nascent sort of Internet of Things developing and this concept of socio-cyberneering or digital feedback, we can completely rethink everything.
Oof. The Internet of Things, honestly, the more I think about it, the more it actually scares the living crap out of me. And I think a lot of it is because we now know that the internet is probably the greatest mechanism ever to deliver advertisements, right? Like this is a medium that has been co-opted by corporate interests to the point where the internet now, like if you have an Alexa in your house, is listening to things you're saying without it even being on, quote unquote, on. For which then when you now surf social media after just talking about pants, all of a sudden you'll have ads for pants, right? Like, so if we're talking about the Internet of Things, if we have smart fridges, smart stoves, smart houses, my immediate mind goes to the way this is going to be completely corrupted by advertising and profit interests. And so the more we develop this Internet of Things, I can see the surveillance system growing right along with it. And I can see more of a dystopia coming from the Internet of Things today than I can see any positive progress. But
what is the alternative to that, though? What is the positive utilization of that? Because it seems like within the mechanism, the value system of profit, even medicine is a weapon. Everything is a weapon. Everything can be weaponized and will be used by the sort of recuperating mechanism of capitalism to make life more deadly and worse and increase that control system. But it's like, if that great condition, the monetary value system is cut out, how could this sort of sense of a socio-cyberneering be implemented for good?
If you ask Jacques about it, Jacques gives an answer that is probably true, but it's unsatisfying as well. So he would say that things probably are going to have to get a hell of a lot worse before we can actually start using these technological tools in a way in which is not exploitive in this financial sense. And I think that is one of the things that scares me the most, is because I think we're so close to a precipice in this world that it's going to be touch and go, as Bucky said. It's going to be touch and go whether we create paradise or oblivion, because we're going to get right up to that precipice of commodifying everything on this planet. And then by the time we realize that is a parasitic and cancerous way of looking at the world and each other, hopefully there will be still a shred of time left for us to turn this around and be, as Bucky would say, the trim tab to our civilization trajectory, where we can actually turn this boat around. So I don't have a lot of positive. I hate to end it on like a like a dark note, but at the same time, I think we need to accept that we haven't gotten to the point yet where most people can hear us. And I think that we need to keep on doing what we're doing and developing systems personally, and developing our own minds personally, and having the talks that we're having now to spread these ideas out more. Because I think there will be a time when we have a chance to turn this boat around and be the trim tab that Bucky always advocated for us to be. But I don't think we're there yet. We're close, but I don't know if we're there yet.
So we need more professors like you, and we need more people supporting alternate media.
Yeah. Yep, that's a good way to look at it.
There we go. I was curious, how long did it take you to get through all your coursework and become a master's in sociology?
It took me about 10 years. If I would have done school full time, it would have been shorter. But I was a single father, taking care of my two kids. Doing all these odd jobs while I was going to school. So it took me 4 years to get my associate's degree, and then almost another 4 years to get my bachelor's degree. And then it took me 2 years to go to Knoxville, Tennessee and get my master's. So, and that was the only time I was able to go to school full time was when I went to Knoxville. So,
well, congratulations. Good for you for sticking with it and seeing it through. And now you're in a position to be able to actually educate and help. And got to commend you for that. That's really cool that you followed through all the way to the end now, and you get to reap the benefits of it and help other people.
Amazing little dedication.
Well, and let me just say one thing about this too, is when they say it takes a village to raise a child, I assure you, it took a village to raise this grad student. Okay, there was a lot of people that helped me along the way, for which I would not be here if I didn't have massive support from people that thought what I had to say and what I wanted to do with my life was valuable. So I was not an island unto myself. This was something I had many people help me along the way to get here. So, but I appreciate that.
Well, that's great for acknowledging that too. Beautiful. I think a lot of people don't acknowledge that also. When a lot of people succeed or go farther in life. I think people are kind of disposed to attribute it to their own work and effort a lot of the time. But that's what you say is exactly true. Also, a lot of us are just in the position and get the help along the way that makes those things possible as well. So that's great for acknowledging that and giving credit where it's due as well. I commend you for that too.
Do you have any kind of closing thoughts, in the spirit of a sort of a new sociological consciousness or a new understanding, or changing our minds to change our worlds?
I'm not sure if I have a profound something to say at the very end, other than, just that.
That's not a tall order.
I know, right? But, I often think about, I can't quote him directly, but David Graeber did say something that does stick with me. He says something to the effect of, like, the world wasn't always like the way it is now, and it doesn't have to be this way. We created this world, and we can just as easily create something different. And I think we need to actually be in the mindset of really trying to create something different and to think of ways to bring that about. And as long as we're in that mindset, I think we're on the right track.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for coming on the show. I really appreciate you taking the time, and it's been some fabulous insights. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. And we hope to have you back again sometime soon, because this has been a lot of fun, and really, really thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to.
Jeff.
Yeah.
Very, very
I appreciate
enjoyable.
all your time as well. I mean, I really do, that you all took the time to talk with me today. I appreciate it.
This is what we do this for, like to be able to brain trust like this, to network our few consciousnesses together to sort of, work on building this thing, this change, this new brain, this human brain, not an individual brain, but a human brain, the mind of humanity, that I had a Bucky quote pulled up here, and he tried to kill himself at one point in his life because he couldn't make money, basically.
What else is new, right?
And he threw himself into a lake, and he was drowning, and he saw a sphere of light, a white sphere of light, a dome, and it spoke to him, and it said, from now on, you need never await temporal attestation to your thought. You think the truth. You do not have the right to eliminate yourself. I see this message at humanity, at all of humanity, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to die because we can't give up this attachment. You do not belong to you. You belong to the universe. Your significance will remain forever obscure to you, but you may assume that you are fulfilling your role if you apply yourself to converting your experiences to the highest advantage of others. And it says he ultimately chose to embark on an experiment to find what a single individual could contribute to changing the world and benefiting all humanity. And I think really if we have more people that can step into that attitude, that understand that we're not an individual, we are a social being. We're not mosquitoes, as Arjang said the other day. We're a social organism. We are our environment. We are not just in it. We don't just use it. That if we can basically...
We are a product of our environment.
If we can basically step into that ecosystem consciousness and switch our sphere of identification, I think we'll all start surging towards solving this problem, and we'll arrive at the conclusion of a better world. So that's my hope. Because when you see the world in a different way, like I'm sure you did when you went and saw Jacques, you saw the world in a new way. Or when after seeing Zeitgeist films, you see the world in a different way. You walk around, you don't live in the old world. That old world is gone. You'll never see it again.
Matrix code now.
That's right. Absolutely.
I think there should be an entire sociology class of just deconstructing the metaphors in the Matrix to society today. Like I think we could have a fascinating class.
Demystify
so much to
things.
unpack. Yeah.
We're living in an illusion, and I think it seems so tantalizingly close to me of achieving this, because it's just getting people to see what was always there, getting people to see it doesn't have to be this way. It's really that simple. It doesn't have to be this way.
Yep.
Absolutely.
We created this situation. We can create something different, right?
So it's getting to be that time again where we top off our ramblings into the infinite complexity of our intractably horrible and beautiful journey through this crazy world, this crazy human experience. And I just got to plug the old YouTube. Like, share, subscribe, follow, donate to our Patreon at patreon.com/Moneyless Society, you know, blah, 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 blah. So this has been the last episode of our first season, and I gotta say, personally, it's been an amazing journey. I've learned so much personally. I didn't know so much of this stuff when I first started. I didn't really know the ins and outs of RVE. I kind of faked it till I made it, and I think, and I hope that other people who have watched and listened have learned as I have and are as inspired as I am that this is the way to go, that there is a solution, a real solution, a holistic, integrated solution that contains all other solutions, that we have a trajectory, that we have options, that things don't have to be this way. So I lied. It's not the last episode. We have one more very special surprise that we will be releasing next week. We have a lot of exciting ideas for season 2, which will probably be starting early next year. So enjoy this break, and please share your feedback. Tell us how you've liked our show. Tell us what you'd like us to talk about. Tell us if you think we talk too much. Some of us, like maybe yours truly. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you don't like. Just give us your feedback. And suggest guests. Tell your friends. If there's somebody you know that you really want to get on the show and you have an in or an out, please link it up. We will talk to pretty much anybody. We want to spread this gospel, this secular gospel, as far and wide as we can. So we wouldn't be here without you, the listeners. There would be no point in any of us learning or knowing better if it wasn't for the opportunity to share it. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your feedback. Thank you for your support. We really appreciate it. I personally appreciate it. I have been working pretty much night and day on activist projects and podcasts and films, not for the money system. I don't make a lot of money, so the Patreon donations and the support and the more tangible and real support, that we're not just talking into the abyss, that this stuff lands, that this makes sense, that we're not alone in thinking that this world doesn't have to be this way. We can make it better. So thank you. And can't wait for what's in store for y'all. I have never been more pessimistic in every single existing human institution, or more optimistic that humanity can get it together. And that's all of us. That I have faith in us. I have faith in people. I have faith in every fucking stranger that I see walking down the street. That even the most aberrant and backwards person in our midst can learn better. And that's our nature. We can change. So, take it easy. But take it.